The setting sun dipped behind the buildings of downtown Sacramento, bathing the city in a glow of soft amber and fading gold. It was the kind of light that made everything seem calmer, as if it could soften the sharp edges of a long day. Eric Porter's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel of his silver sedan as he cruised through the streets, thinking about dinner and how quickly he could kick off his shoes once he got home. The faint hum of the engine and the low murmur of the jazz station on the radio were almost enough to pull him away from the endless stream of emails and phone calls that had filled his afternoon. Almost. He slowed his car as he approached an intersection, watching the yellow light blink its warning before shifting to red. It was second nature by now, easing to a careful stop. Just another few blocks and he'd be home. But then came the sudden flicker of flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Red and blue strobing sharply against the muted glow of the evening. A sharp wail of a siren followed, cutting through the jazz, through the calm, through the quiet. Eric sighed, his brows pulling together ever so slightly. He wasn't speeding. He was sure of it. He put on his signal and pulled over to the curb with a practiced smoothness, rolling down his window with a resigned calm. The patrol cruiser behind him rumbled to a halt. Eric watched in the side mirror as a uniformed officer emerged and approached with a swagger that spoke of someone used to being the one in charge. Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s with a military buzz cut and a badge that gleamed like a challenge. He adjusted his duty belt as he neared, his boots making soft, sure thuds on the pavement. When he spoke, it was with a voice that was flat but edged with something sharper. Authority that didn't ask it told. License and registration, Larson said. His tone curt, as though he already knew how the next few minutes were going to play out. Eric said nothing at first, simply reaching toward the glove compartment. His movements were slow, deliberate. He knew how important that was. No sudden moves. He retrieved the paperwork and handed it over through the open window, his fingers steady. Larson took them, his eyes lingering on Eric a little longer than necessary, scanning his face as if it held some clue to a puzzle he hadn't yet figured out. "You know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked. He leaned in slightly, just enough to let the weight of his presence fill the small space between them. Eric kept his gaze steady. "I'm not sure," he replied. His tone was polite. Even, not challenging, not submissive. "I believe I slowed in time for the light." Larson made a small sound. A grunt of acknowledgement, or dismissal. It was hard to tell. "Didn't come to a complete stop," he said. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. "At least that's what I saw." Eric gave a small nod. "I understand." Larson didn't respond right away. He stared for another long moment, as if deciding what he was looking for, and maybe whether he'd found it. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted. Slightly harder now. "You from around here?" "I moved here recently," Eric said. He kept his voice calm, matter of fact. "My address is on the license." But it was clear Larson wasn't listening to the words. His eyes had narrowed, his jaw shifting as if chewing on something he didn't much like. The questions weren't about a traffic stop anymore. Not really. Eric could feel it. The shift, the unspoken suspicion settling into Larson's voice like a shadow. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" the officer asked. "Home," Eric replied. "As I said." Larson took a step back. It wasn't retreat, though it was space. Space he could use however he chose. He folded Eric's license and registration together with a slow precision, sliding them into his chest pocket, like a bookmark in a story he wasn't finished telling. There was something smug creeping onto his face. As though whatever was about to happen, he'd already decided who was right and who wasn't. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. For a beat, Eric didn't move. His hands stayed on the wheel. He met Larsen's gaze, calm and steady. "Is there a reason, officer?" Larsen smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I asked you to step out. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be." The warning was clear, even if it wasn't spoken outright. Eric took a breath, his jaw tightening for half a second, and then he released the handle on the door. He stepped out with the same slow, measured grace he'd shown in the car. Standing at his full height, he was just a little taller than Larsen, and for a brief moment, it shifted the balance of the space between them. But Eric's posture was not aggressive, not submissive, controlled. "Hands where I can see them," Larsen said, motioning toward the hood of the car. Eric complied. He moved slowly, placing his hands flat on the smooth metal surface of his sedan. The warmth of the engine still lingered beneath his palms. His voice, when it came again, was calm. "Is there something specific you're searching for, officer?" "Just doing my job," Larsen said with a smirk. "Can't be too careful. We've had some incidents in the area." Eric turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back. Incidents involving men in suits, driving home from work. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Larsen's expression cracked. His fingers twitched, hovering near his belt, but he covered it quickly. "Watch your tone." "I'm asking a question," Eric replied. There was no heat in his words, no bite, just the calm precision of someone who wasn't playing the same game. Larsen stared at him. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he muttered, almost to himself, "You seem awfully sure of yourself." Eric didn't respond. He didn't need to. The balance of the moment had shifted. He let it hang there, quiet and steady. Larsen moved in closer again, his eyes sharper now, looking for something, anything. "Turn around," Larsen said. "Hands on the hood. I'm checking for weapons." Eric arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. He returned his hands to the car, resuming the pose. He said quietly, "Do I look like I'm carrying a weapon?" Larsen ignored the question. His hands ran roughly over Eric's arms, his sides, his legs. It wasn't a search. It was an invasion. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He stood there and let the moment pass. "You're clean," Larsen muttered finally. It sounded like a defeat. Eric straightened. "Of course I am." But Larsen wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. "What's your deal?" he asked. "You a lawyer or something?" Eric gave him a faint smile. "Or something." And just like that, the officer's patience frayed. He stepped in close, too close. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and frustration. "You think you're smarter than me?" Eric met his gaze, calm and steady. "I don't think anything. But I do believe in fairness. And this?" He gestured between them with a small movement of his head. "This isn't it." Larsen stiffened. For a moment, the weight of what he wasn't saying hung there in the heavy air between them. "People like you," Larsen said, his voice taut. Eric nodded slowly. "People like me." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a surprise. For the first time, Larsen took a step back. A small one, barely noticeable, but Eric noticed. He reached into his pocket. Slowly, deliberately. "I'm going to show you something," he said. Larsen's hand hovered near his holster, but Eric simply pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge gleaming in the dimming light. "Couric Porter," he said, his voice quiet. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larsen's face blanched. And in that moment, everything changed. For a few moments, Officer Larsen just stared. His breathing was heavy, but his words wouldn't come. The badge glinted faintly in the setting sun, undeniable and absolute in what it meant. The man he had pulled over, treated like a suspect, was the one man who could determine whether he stayed in uniform. Eric Porter didn't move. He didn't need to. The weight of that badge spoke for him. And Larsen, for all his bravado, couldn't ignore it. Eric's expression didn't change. He closed his wallet slowly, slipping it back into his pocket with the same calm deliberation he had shown all along. His gaze never left Larsen's face. "You understand what this means," he said, his voice even. There was no satisfaction in his tone, no sense of victory, just quiet certainty. Larsen took a step back, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. He glanced around, as if hoping someone might explain how he'd ended up here. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His confidence was slipping through his fingers, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. Eric let the silence stretch between them before speaking again. "I gave you every opportunity to handle this professionally, every chance to treat this like the simple traffic stop it was. You chose something else." His words weren't loud, but they landed hard, each syllable like a brick laid carefully into place. Larsen's mouth opened, closed. When he finally found his voice, it was hoarse. "I didn't know who you were." Eric tilted his head slightly. "That's the problem. You thought you knew who I was." He stepped forward, closing the distance Larsen had instinctively tried to create. "You saw me, and you made assumptions. You escalated this because of them. You forgot why you're wearing that badge in the first place." Larsen's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He shook his head, a useless gesture at this point. "This isn't. I didn't." Eric didn't let him finish. "You did exactly what I've spent my career investigating. You let your judgment cloud your duty. And if I had been anyone else, if I didn't know my rights, if I didn't understand the power dynamics at play here, you'd have had me cuffed in the back of your cruiser by now." The words hung there, undeniable. Larsen's hands dropped from his belt. His gaze shifted to the ground, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. Eric took a breath, measured and calm. "Return my license." Larsen moved automatically, his fingers fumbling as he pulled the documents from his pocket. He handed them over without meeting Eric's eyes. His hand trembled. Eric took his license and registration with a nod of acknowledgement, slipping them back into his wallet. He said nothing for a moment, letting Larsen sit with the weight of his own choices. "You're going to hear from me again," Eric said, his tone now edged with something colder. "This isn't where this ends." Larsen nodded stiffly. He was no longer the man who had walked up to Eric's car with casual confidence. That man was gone. In his place was an officer who understood, far too late, what it meant to misuse power. Eric opened the door to his car and slid inside, shutting it quietly behind him. He adjusted his seatbelt with slow precision, then started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Larsen still stood there, frozen beside his cruiser, watching him leave. The drive home was uneventful, but Eric's mind was already turning. He knew what needed to happen next. He couldn't afford to let this go. And more importantly, he didn't want to. Not for himself, but for everyone else who wouldn't have had the chance to pull out a badge and reclaim the narrative. He thought about the people who'd sat where he sat and hadn't been believed. About those who'd been silenced, cuffed, or worse. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd already made up his mind. This wasn't going to be another story that ended quietly. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk on the 6th floor of the Sacramento Internal Affairs Division. The view from his office stretched out over the downtown skyline, but his focus was on the files neatly stacked in front of him. Larsen's personnel record was there, open to a page marked by a thin, red tab. Complaints. Minor infractions. Notes about conduct that had been flagged but never followed up on. Each one told a story, and none of them were good. Eric's fingers drummed softly on the edge of the desk as he read. He didn't look away from the reports, even when his assistant, Linda, stepped into the room. "Morning," she said, holding a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. "I've got the data you asked for. Department-wide stop and search rates, broken down by district." He glanced up, offering a brief nod. "Leave it there." He pointed to the space beside the files. Linda set the tablet down, then hesitated. "Is this about what happened yesterday?" she asked carefully. Eric leaned back in his chair. "In part. Larson's just a symptom." Linda frowned, sensing the weight in his words. "And the rest of it." Eric gave a quiet exhale. "We've got an infection that's spreading. I'm not going to slap a bandage on it and hope for the best." Linda nodded, then retreated from the room, leaving him to his work. Eric spent the better part of the day reviewing files. Larson wasn't the only officer who had slid through the cracks. There were others. Too many. Each file represented a choice. Someone who had decided to look the other way instead of asking hard questions. He wouldn't be one of them. By the afternoon, he had what he needed. The meeting with Chief Daniels was scheduled for 3 o'clock. Eric arrived precisely on time, his files neatly organized in his leather briefcase. Daniels was already seated at the long conference table, his gray eyes sharp and assessing as Eric sat down. "Porter," Daniels greeted, his tone unreadable. "You've got something urgent." Eric slid the file across the table. "Larson," he said, simply. Daniels opened it without hesitation. He read in silence for several minutes, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. When he closed the file, he sighed heavily. "We've been watching him," Daniels admitted, "but nothing concrete. Until now." "Bah," Eric nodded. "And you've got it, and he's not alone." Daniels sat back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "You want to do a sweep?" "I want a full review," Eric clarified. "Procedure. Personnel. If we don't fix the culture, we're just swapping out faces." Daniels studied him for a long time before finally nodding. "You'll have support. But this isn't going to be popular." Eric's mouth tightened into a line. Good. Popularity isn't my concern." Daniels gave a faint smile. "I remember when you first joined this division. You said you wanted to change the world." "I still do," Eric said. His gaze was unwavering. "And this is where it starts." Over the next few weeks, Eric's plan took shape. Department-wide audits, mandatory retraining, public forums for transparency. Internal affairs wasn't going to be a place where complaints went to die. It was going to be the place where change took root. Larson's suspension was the first ripple. His hearing had been swift. The evidence spoke for itself. Eric had made sure of that. But it was never about just one man. Eric was already thinking about the next steps. The ones that would take longer but would matter more. The community meetings were the hardest part. Listening to the stories, the fear, the distrust. But they were also the most important. Because that was where the healing had to begin. Eric stood in those rooms, wearing his badge. Not as a shield, but as a promise. "We have to do better," he told them. "And we will." By the end of the month, change was already taking hold. And Eric knew. This was just the beginning. The months that followed marked a shift no one could have predicted. What started as a single traffic stop had become the spark for something larger. Something necessary. Eric Porter's name was now synonymous with reform inside the Sacramento Police Department. Not because he sought attention, but because he refused to let things stay the same. It wasn't easy. Change never was. There were late nights, pushback from within the ranks, and plenty of moments when it felt like the old system would swallow them whole. But Eric kept going. Every policy rewritten, every retraining session held. Every officer held accountable. Each one chipped away at the culture that had made someone, like Bradley Larson, believe he could act without consequence. Larson's suspension became permanent. His badge was officially revoked after the review board ruled on his conduct. When he cleared out his locker, there was no send-off, no quiet handshake or nod of respect from fellow officers. His fall had been public, his name now a warning to anyone who thought they could wear a badge without upholding what it stood for. But Eric wasn't interested in revenge. It was never about taking someone down. It was about building something better. One Friday evening, Eric found himself back where it had all started, driving home under a sky streaked with gold. The same streets, the same city, but a different man behind the wheel. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from Chief Daniels. The board had just approved the final phase of Eric's reform proposal. A new generation of recruits would enter the academy with a training program that taught not just law enforcement, but empathy, accountability, and respect. Eric smiled faintly, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Progress wasn't always fast, but it was happening. At a stoplight, a patrol car pulled up beside him. The officer inside gave him a nod. Eric nodded back, their exchange brief but genuine. This wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was mutual respect, the way it should be. When he pulled into his driveway, Denise was there waiting, arms crossed, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Making waves again, she teased as he got out of the car. "Trying," Eric replied, stepping toward her. She shook her head. "You always said you would." He smiled. "And I'm not done yet." That night, as he sat in his living room, reports spread out on the coffee table, Eric realized that the badge he wore was heavier now. But it was the kind of weight he welcomed. A reminder that change isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for. Every day. For everyone. Because the job wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. And Eric Porter carried that responsibility like a promise he refused to break. And this time, he wasn't carrying it alone.